Hi class. So I just wanted to make this video to kind of run through the prompt. So the idea here is to basically I want you to expand upon the poem that you wrote about last week. So you supposedly chose one of these poems. You did your written response and you did the discussion forum that you chose one of these claims from the critic, right? So the prompt is write an essay in which you respond to literary critic Floyd Stovall's claims about Poe's theory on poetry, right? So I recommend you expand on your discussion forum from last week. However, you can add another claim to supplement the one you have already responded to, especially if you feel like you won't have enough information to develop, a 3 to 5 page essay. For example, you might have agreed with Stovall and his claim that Poe believes the true poem must be brief. Now that's kind of there's not a lot going on with that claim. I mean, you could turn it into a full-fledged essay, as I say here. So I do believe you could flesh this out into an essay, but it might be more fruitful to add one other claim, right? Either way, Stovall's claim and your opinion of whether or not that claim is true will be your thesis statement. Here's an example of a thesis statement that combines two of Stovall's claims. William Stovall asserts that, when writing poetry, a true poem must be brief and its tone should be sadness or melancholy, and this is evident with Poe's poem Spirits of the Dead. Now, I just threw that title in there, but so you can see that I basically did a combination of two of the claims. I did this one over here, that the poem is brief, and the one at the very end, that the tone of the poem should be sadness or melancholy, right? Okay, so if you paid attention to the videos that I've done the last few weeks or so, I made a video on Poe's The Bells, and I basically structured an outline based on the prompt for this week, all right? So this is a basic, what we would call a thesis outline, where you just state your thesis statement here and the points that you want to use to support it. So I kind of sketched this out to help you out. All right, so my thesis is, and it's basically a combination of two sentences, which is not a problem. William Stovall offers insight into Edgar Allan Poe's poetic mind, asserting that, quote, the pleasure derived from the poem differs from that derived from the romance in being indefinite, not definite, right? A close analysis of Poe's The Bells proves Stovall's claim to be true. All right. So basically, I took this claim from Stovall, right? And I used that as the basis for my thesis statement. Right? Once again, William Stovall offers insight into Edgar Allan Poe's poetic mind, asserting that, quote, the pleasure derived from the poem differs from that derived from the romance in being indefinite, not definite. Okay, so there's the claim. And my follow-up is right here. A close analysis of Poe's The Bells proves Stovall's claims to be true, so I'm actually going to agree with that claim. And I basically laid out a 3-point sketch outline. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is kind of lay out for my reader Poe's a definition of poetry. And I'm going to use this quote from The Poetic Principle, which is in our anthology towards the end. And here's the quote. I would define, in brief, the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty. Its sole arbiter is taste. With the intellect or with the conscience, it has only collateral relations. Unless, incidentally, it has no concern whatever, either with duty or with truth. So what Poe is kind of going kind of criticizing here is the idea that a poem has a definite message, that it is somehow a didactic, right? Which means that it's meant to teach some sort of moral lesson or a lesson, okay? So my first point then is going to be kind of brief, but I'm basically going to let my reader know Poe's thoughts about poetry. Then, so this will be about a paragraph. In point number 2, right, I'm going to explain how Poe's ideas are a little bit different from the romantic poets, right, because that's part of this claim, right? So the romantic poets kind of had this idea that a poem was a definite, right, that it kind of conveyed a pleasurable experience. And I just stated here that Poe kind of was against that, right? So I'm going to kind of elaborate on that with point number 2. I'm going to use William Wordsworth, right, as the example of the definite, right? Poetry should be a pleasurable experience. Maybe I would find a quote from a Wordsworth poem. One of my favorite poems from him happens to be We Are Seven, where it's kind of like a recollection of a childhood experience, okay? And then I would transition, maybe start a new paragraph, so it might be point 2a and point 2b, or maybe just continue on with the paragraph. I'm not sure yet. But I would talk about how Poe has this sort of indefinite, right? Poe depends on the context of the reader's state of mind, and that it doesn't have to be a definite experience, right? So the Romantics thought that poems had to be a pleasurable experience. Poe says, no, it doesn't have to be. It kind of depends on what's transpiring within the reader's mind. And I'm going to back that up with another quote from Poetic Principle, right? Quote, it is to be hoped that common sense in the time to come will prefer deciding upon a work of art rather by the impression it makes, by the effect. So notice that Poe is, right, Poe wants to focus on the effect, right? That by the time it took to impress the effect, or by the amount of sustained effort which had been found necessarily in affecting the impression. That is, that perseverance is one thing and genius is quite another. So I would kind of unpack this quote to further support this idea that I stated in point 1, that a poem doesn't necessarily have to have some sort of pleasurable experience. It doesn't have to have a positive lesson, okay? And then finally with point 3, I'm going to back all this up by using examples from the bells. Right? So my point in point 3 would be, explain how the bells doesn't have a definite purpose and depends on the reader's psyche. Poetry doesn't have to be pleasurable. For example, the bells conjures up several different emotions. And then I would use the example from that first stanza that I kind of elaborated on in past lectures, right? That those sleigh bells of wintertime have a positive association, right? What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night. Okay? That same paragraph, I would transition and say, but look at the next stanza. And this is actually stanza 3, maybe 4, right? But it has a negative association. Hear the loud alarm bells, brazen bells, right? So we've gone from this lighthearted sleigh bell, right? You know, on a cool wintry night to these negative brazen, brash sounding bells, right? What tell of terror now their turbulency tells, and the startled ear of night, how they scream out their affright. So within these 2 stanzas, here there are 2 different kinds of emotions, which in turn kind of supports Poe's the poetic theory, right? For my quote here, and also here. So it does kind of all wrap together. Again, you structure your paper how you want it. You know, I'm anticipating maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs, right? And it all depends on the claim you choose and whether or not that poem that you chose from last week kind of affirms the claim, or maybe you think it doesn't necessarily, that it doesn't necessarily jive with that claim. But that's entirely up to you. Thanks for listening.